These business practices through the BRI effectively subvert accountability processes, provide opportunities for corruption. They allow ruling elites to govern for their personal and political benefit. And we can see a correlation between that and then support for Chinese interests.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Welcome to another episode of the Briefing Room. My name is Jared Mondschein. I am the Director of Research at the U.S. Study Center, and I am pleased to be joined today by Dr. Lavina. But before we get started, I first want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands we are on today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'm particularly glad to be joined by Dr. Lee because she not only has an impressive bio, but she's come out with a new report. Now let's first just talk about her bio. So she's not only a non-resident fellow with us at the U.S. Study Center and a senior lecturer at the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University, but from 2020 to 2023, the defense minister had appointed her to the Council of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and she was previously a director of the Institute for Regional Security. And before joining Macquarie University in 2007, she was a political risk consultant with Control Risk. I mentioned her bio because what I love about Dr. Lee is that she's able to really bring the academic approach to these issues along with a more practical approach. And nowhere is that more relevant than in the report that she has just launched on Japanese and Australian democracy support in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The U.S. Study Center was really pleased to be a partner for this and publishing this, and joined by the Japan Foundation as well as Macquarie University. And this report that has just been released is something that touches on an issue that has long been a focus of mine at the U.S. Study Center as well as the U.S. Study Center more broadly. So before I get to that, Lavina, one thing we do on our podcast here is we talk about a stat or a figure that we think is important to note at the end of the podcast. Some folks have that ready to go. Some folks try to think about that in the course of our conversation. But I just want to confirm that you're okay with a stat, a fact, or a figure that we think we should mention at the end of the podcast.
Okay, sure. Do you want me to tell you now?
No, we'll save it for later. We'll keep the audience looking forward to that later. But for now, let's actually get into the discussion of this fantastic report. Could you maybe just give us sort of a background? What is this report and how did it come up and why did you want to do a report about these issues?
Look, I have been looking at how the liberal international order has come under stress in the Indo-Pacific over the last few years. And I've been looking at it in different guises. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a report for the US Study Center on democracy support as part of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, at that time, and I think still continuing, this idea that support for democracy within other countries as part of foreign policy or aid is very unusual or not emphasized in countries outside of the United States. So one, I was very interested in looking at, okay, well, the rules-based order is under stress. It's not just under stress in terms of interstate relations or even trade and economic relations, but there is also a contest going on, a contest of ideas about what is the most effective, most supportive forms of political system within the state. And we now have, I think, authoritarian countries that are rising in terms of their influence. But also we can see that democracy has been in decline for the 18th consecutive year. And when I'm talking about democracy, I mean political rights and civil liberties. And Freedom House is an organization that releases a report every year. And their last report said, yes, 18 years running, civil liberties and political rights have diminished in 52 countries and improved in only 21. So there are a number of reasons why that decline in democracy is occurring, which I can speak about. But one of the main reasons is also the fact that we have a shift in the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. And with the shift in the balance of power comes a shift in also the kind of ideological underpinnings of the order that the United States has led since World War II.
That's great. So one thing that I really liked about your report is that it's not just, I loved the report you published with us a few years ago, but that was just your view on what's going on and your recommendations on the pathway forward to sort of take on this the deteriorating level of democracies in the region. You incorporated other authors in your write-up. So maybe could you just give an idea of like who are the authors and why did you have other authors and what role did you view in their chapters in this?
Well, I approached the Japan Foundation because I was looking to include the views of Japanese scholars in this question of what are the kind of major challenges to the rules-based order. And I look at Japan because Japan is almost, I think, a pseudo-alliance partner of Australia at the moment. I think we share a very similar view, particularly since the leadership of the former Prime Minister Abe in Japan, who also shared that view that the rules-based order is coming under threat because of China's rise and the kinds of policies and behavior that it was displaying in both Southeast Asia, but also in East Asia. And Japan, under Abe, took a more values-based turn in their foreign policy. So for the first time, you'd hear Shinzo Abe and others in his cabinet talking about the importance of the rules-based order, the importance of the kind of rule of law, the law of the sea, was all about behavior, stability, and for the first time, a championing of this idea that democracies had to work together to effectively safeguard the rules-based order and counter any negative consequences of it. So I wanted to talk to some Japanese scholars because I think in Japan, even though we share those things, in Japanese foreign policy and aid policy, democracy support doesn't actually feature that highly. So whilst we might have a similar view about the free and open Indo-Pacific and a strategy towards that, Japan itself has not really used its aid to support democracy within other states. Now, Australia does to some extent, but what is very similar about both our countries is that we don't really talk about it. We don't really say that we're doing it, and we only do some aspects of it. So it's not as though it's highly emphasized. So I wanted to get the views of others in Japan about why that might be. So what are the similarities and differences between our approach? Why do we take a different approach to the United States? Should we be doing more in terms of democracy support? And if so, what should we be doing more of?
And so who did you get to present the Japanese views on these issues?
I got three scholars, Professor Hiroaki Shiga. Professor Shiga has been writing about the values-based turn in Japanese foreign policy. He's published a number of academic and also research reports for CSIS on this topic. We have Chikako Kodama, who is a former practitioner who has worked for the UNDP and also for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. And we have Dr. Yuki Miyoda, who's been looking at environmental and social principles and how they could be applied to both aid policy and financing by Japan. So I thought they were, a good mix of skills and interests, research interests, and they, in combination, could look at the kind of big picture of what Japan is doing, where values lie within Japanese foreign policy, but also get a view of the practical implementation of it.
Great. All right. So now we got your take on why this is important, why this is relevant. I would love to hear from you then on the top level takeaway. What did you learn? That I should note that the entire report is over 40,000 words long. I enjoyed editing every word. I mean that seriously. This is a delightful report. But what did you learn? What do you take away, both as you were writing this, as well as talking to your other co-authors over the course of this project?
Okay, well, I think ultimately, if there was one key takeaway, is that supporting democracy might seem too American. It might seem too ideological. The United States has been supporting democracy through the National Endowment for Democracy and the work of various organizations. They wear that promotion of democracy on their sleeve. You'll hear about President Biden talking about democracy summits and putting democracy at the center of American foreign policy. You won't hear that in Japan and Australia. And the key takeaway for me is, even if we don't wear it on our sleeve in the same way, we should be thinking about the strategic consequences of not being more supportive of democracy in terms of our strategic interests in two areas of the world that we prioritize, which is Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but that also that there is a concerted level of democratic backsliding. I've just spoken about the 18-year decline in democracy, and the Indo-Pacific is no different. We can see that democratic decline in the Indo-Pacific as well. And that should be of concern to us because there does seem to be a high degree of correlation between democratic backsliding, Chinese behavior and policy in both Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and that China is actually a key actor that is having an impact and in that democratic decline, and that has consequences for us strategically, but also that our aid programs are all about poverty reduction and sustainable development. And we know that the more we see democratic backsliding, those objectives themselves are also undermined.
So in terms of what the way you've broken this down in your report is you have a section looking at Australia's approach to democracy support, and then Australia's engagement on democracy support in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And then similarly, you have a Japanese overview of democracy support, then Japanese support for democracy support, or Japanese democracy support in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. We've heard how Japan and Australia are a bit different than the US. How do you compare them to each other in terms of their democracy support efforts?
Okay, so what's similar is that both don't do it overtly. So if you look at their overarching development policy documents, there's no mention of democracy support being a priority. So if you look at, in terms of differences though, Australia has been practicing a level of democracy support in both Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So you will see, if you looked at Southeast Asia and the Pacific, it's around 21 to 25% of our aid budget goes to what they describe as governance. So they don't call it democracy support, they call it governance. And then when you drill down into what governance means, some of it does actually include aspects of democracy support. So there will be support for elections. There will be some support for the training of journalists. But there will be a mention of how civil society is important, and some of our aid is actually delivered through civil society organizations in recipient countries. Now, all of those things are good things. They are supportive of democracy, but I would still say that the primary motivation for democracy support, governance support, is actually all about capacity building and service delivery, and building those capacities of recipient governments in both Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Now, you might ask me, well, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with actually supporting governments to deliver services and provide better governance to their people. But there's nothing very specific there about improving cultures of democracy within a society. So there's nothing there about improving transparency and accountability of decision-making, of supporting the building of alternative centers of power within a country. So civil society and media who would demand more accountability and transparency for their governments. You might be delivering services through civil society, but you're not really questioning what kinds of civil society organizations are you supporting, for what purpose, and how are you empowering them to enter into the political process and make those kinds of demands for accountability and transparency. So I'm in terms of Australia, we do more democracy support type activities, but the percentage of the budget that goes towards specifically improving transparency and accountability measures is probably not as great as it should be. When it comes to Japan, you'll see that in terms of its ODA over the last 10 years or so, around 50% of its ODA is directed towards infrastructure. And in 2022, I believe the percentage devoted to democracy support was 0.46% of all ODA. So you can see how much Japan actually supports any of those activities that I just mentioned that Australia does support. So there's a big difference in terms of emphasis, but I would also say there is, in both cases, this idea that if you help countries to develop economically, that somehow over time they will also develop greater democratic practices. But I think that comes out in our report that I think that assumption should be questioned. Just looking at the kind of success of our ODA programs in that sense, there isn't necessarily a correlation between, more economic development necessarily leading to greater democratization. I think from Japan's perspective, they look at their own experience and they look and see, okay, well, we developed that way. We democratized after we developed, and they think that type of approach still is valid. Nevertheless, if you look at the ODA and the amount of ODA they actually put towards democracy support, you can see it's pretty minuscule. 0.46% is almost, just not significant at all.
You mentioned how there's there seems to be more collective recognition of the democratic backsliding, but also how the U.S., Australia, and Japan have adopted Shinzo Abe's free and open Indo-Pacific approach. So there seems to be, in our public polling at the Study Center confirms that there seems to be sort of consensus view on China and consensus view that China is a challenge. There also, in terms of addressing the challenge, you can go a step further in there, and polling seems to indicate that there's also a consensus view on the need for working with allies and partners in championing these things. From my perspective, there seems to be the greatest rhetorical gap between the U.S. and its Indo-Pacific allies on this democracy support. What do you sort of attribute that gap to? I mean, is it because the U.S. is bigger and it can afford to talk about, uncomfortable things? Is it because, we had in the U.S. a revolution creating our democracy? What do you attribute those differences to?
Look, I think in terms of Australia, I think Australia is a liberal democratic country. It's very proud of being that. If you read, I'm sure you listen to the speeches of our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, they will talk about Australia being a democracy and being quite proud of that. But at the same time, if you think about geographically where we are, we're in Asia, and the Pacific. There are democracies in Asia and the Pacific, quite a large number of them, but they're all varying levels of democratization or strengths of their democratic institutions. So I think Japan, South Korea, Australia are probably similar in terms of the robustness of our democracies. Taiwan, can't forget to mention Taiwan and how robust that democracy is. But then if you look all the way throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific, there are many democracies, but they're very varying in terms of the strength of those democracies. So I think in the past, and it continues today, Australia is attempting to build bridges and be included within Southeast Asia and less so the Pacific. I think we're already included by the Pacific. So the idea is that if we emphasize democracy too much and liberal democracy particularly, are we setting ourselves apart too much from our region? Could other countries look at us as imposing our particular values on them and their particular historical circumstances, the level of development that they have? I think Australia is very concerned about that perception that we're imposing values on others. I think there is an element of seeking to avoid that idea that we're kind of Western colonialists who come in and tell everybody how to do things and that we've got it right. And I think Japan is very similar in that way. And they've got the addition of historical baggage from World War II in Southeast Asia. And they too want to be seen as a partner and not a kind of external actor that's different, that comes in and imposes values. So I think a difference is that we, as you said, I think Jared quite correctly, we are, Australia's a middle, I guess we call ourselves middle power. Japan is more, probably a bit more robust in that sense, so probably can achieve more on its own than we can ourselves. But I think we are in this region and therefore worried about perceptions of us in this region in a way that the United States doesn't have to worry about it because of their size and strength.
Thank you. I guess in this new era, though, you talk about how there have been more discussions than ever about the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister here in Australia, but also in Japanese rhetoric and government documents talking about the need for democracy. And, I don't know if the Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister were necessarily talking about democracy 10, 20 years ago in the same way that they are now, right? Do you see in the last few years sort of trends towards this becoming bigger in terms of the sort of, I guess my question is, have we reached peak democracy support in the US, Australia, and Japan? Do you see their ambitions for more, but not being met by budget realities? Where do you see this trend line going in terms of that in the past few years, in the way that there's been more of a sort of a public discussion of democracy than ever?
Yeah, look, I have to give you a bit of a nuanced answer about it. I think being a typical academic, I'm afraid, I think so. If you look at, say, in the case of Japan, as I said earlier, is much more talking about values all the time, talking about the importance of rules, values, being a democracy. I think Australia, under the Morrison government, I think reached peak rhetoric about autocracies versus democracies. And you'll see that in kind of messaging to the region, we don't talk about ideology. I think we probably reached peak values-based diplomacy in that Morrison period. And now I think the current government is trying to improve relations with China and not seeming to use too much rhetoric that might be antagonistic. Now, nevertheless, even though we might see a toning down of rhetoric, I think what is quite obvious is that they do think that this is an important challenge, and that China is presenting a comprehensive challenge. It's not just about technology or military and security. It's also a contest of ideas and about standards. It's about the WTO and what rules we have there. All the WHO, all of those things are all about rules and norms and institutions, and democracy is part of that. Now, I would say you could also see quite obviously that Australia chooses its partners based on their domestic values. So all of our major partners are democracies. So it's Japan, India, the United States. There's more work with the Europeans through NATO, through the EU itself, through the G7. So in terms of top-line rhetoric, the top-line rhetoric might be toned down, but the actual substance is this idea that autocracies are on the rise and we need to work with democracies to counter those challenges. Now, one of the greatest impetuses for this report is that I could see this reticence to talk about democracy, and you could see that also being reflected in how aid is delivered through Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So in a sense, when you don't talk about democracy or you don't overtly say that it's important, that also then feeds and filters through your programming in terms of ODA. Now, from my Japanese counterparts who unfortunately are not able to join us today, I have to relay their positions in their papers. And one of the things that they are worried about is the fact that Japan is trying to counter Chinese influence, and they see that Japan's own strategic influence is taking a hit, even though in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, everybody thinks Japan is a very positive force for good. Yet China is making significant inroads in terms of Japan's traditional influence in Southeast Asia, particularly. And that is leading Japan to concentrate more on the external aspects of international order, on the rule of law, on maritime security, and countering China that way. They're also trying to compete with China and China's BRI through their ODA program. But it also seems to be that they are actually decreasing their support for democratization and prioritizing the more obvious kind of military strategic aspects, but also competition through infrastructure. I think Australia is taking a bit more of a holistic view. So if we look at our policy towards the Pacific, so we got a big wake-up call with the Solomon Islands signing a security agreement with China, and that we now see that there are, well, we did know this, there were other countries where China has been attempting to also get port access and a kind of foothold for their military in the Pacific. Australia, under the Albanese government, has been completely prioritising diplomacy to the Pacific, infrastructure, defence and security, very comprehensive in those areas. And I think that's actually a good policy. But I see one particular gap is that even though we give around 40% of aid to the Pacific, from 2008 to 2022. We're the highest aid providers to the Pacific. Yet we can see that China is gaining significant influence in the Pacific at our expense. And what I wanted to draw attention to is that kind of oversized influence is being executed through what we call elite capture, the ability to effectively capture the very small handful of elites that run many Pacific countries, either to reward those particular elites personally or politically through various infrastructure and other investment projects. They reward countries for swapping their recognition to China from Taiwan. There are also a number of documented instances where BRI-type funding is also used to directly apply corrupt payments to politicians in return for access to business contracts, to infrastructure deals, etc. And in the process of doing that, the way that China does that, it's actually a major cause of democratic backsliding in the Pacific, but we can also see it in Southeast Asia in places like the Maldives, also Sri Lanka and Malaysia, and the 1MDB scandal. So it's not just something that occurs in the Pacific, it also occurs in Southeast Asia. And China's kind of business practices, the way it runs its BRI, is non-transparent. It provides opportunities for corruption for ostensibly elected democratic elites to benefit personally and politically. And in the long run, if this keeps continuing, that actually leads to more democratic decline. But it also leads to a degradation of the strategic influence of other democracies like Australia and Japan.
I think that's a great point, talking about the strategic influence. And I think a lot of people assume that values is something that is nice to have, not a need to have. And they overlook the fact that having more democracies in the region, in my view, I think is in Australia and Japanese and American self-interest, national self-interest. And that provides for a more stable and a more secure region. And those democracies may not always get along perfectly, but they are not, very rarely are they revisionist with a active foreign policy that undermines the rules-based order. You know, you spoke about elite capture, Lavina, and you talk about democratic backsliding in the region. But can you maybe just paint a picture of what does elite capture actually look like on the ground in the region?
Okay, well, you know, it's hard to kind of document everything, but there's some actually quite kind of big glaring examples of how China uses effectively corrupt payments to influence elites, either for their personal benefit or to be used through various patronage networks. And say in the Pacific, I think a couple of kind of glaring examples were, one was in 2018, Singapore corruption investigators uncovered a $1 million bribe, or reportedly a $1 million bribe, to the former Prime Minister of PNG, Sir Michael Somare, from a slush fund of around $4.7 million established by ZTE, which is a telecommunications company, tech company of China, to ensure that it was awarded a contract in the PNG. So that's an example of the kind of business practices that Chinese companies use. And in terms of our own wake-up call in the Pacific, we know that Prime Minister Sogavare in the Solomons doesn't seem to like Australia terribly much, but is very fond of China, and seems to repeat a lot of Chinese talking points about Australia and other Western countries. And I think in terms of elite capture there, there's very credible reporting in the Australian media about how he used a similar slush fund provided by the Chinese to give any politician around $44,000, I think that's Australian dollars, to those politicians who would support him in a no confidence motion. And that no confidence motion came around 2 weeks after there was rioting in the Solomon's capital. And that was the same rioting that Australia sent our own police forces to help quell. So we could see how we might be, trying to do the right thing to help our Pacific neighbours restore order. But then you've got China also then supporting politicians with these covert slush funds to keep themselves in power and keeping politicians who effectively support Chinese policy and interests.
I guess my question to you next would be, we, as I said before, have seen a lot of consensus about the challenge of China and working with allies and partners, and then we still have that rhetorical gap in terms of championing democracies. And you addressed why there seems to be, or democratic support. You said why there's some of the reasoning for why there is that gap. But what is your pitch to the Japanese leadership and the Australian leadership for why they should do this? You have, your stump speech to the prime ministers of Australia and Japan, and you have to make a compelling, succinct argument to them for why it's in their national interest. What is it for you? And that we have this excellent academic report, but what should they take away from it?
Okay. My main pitch would be, as you said earlier, for many people, they think democracy support is a bit peripheral to the main game. If there's geostrategic competition going on in the Indo-Pacific, where would democracy support really fit in? Is it just a kind of minor issue? I think it's actually at the center of that strategic competition. So it's actually a missing piece of defense of the free and open Indo-Pacific order. This lack of concerted support for democracy actually allows Chinese practices that degrade democracy to go unmet. These business practices through the BRI effectively subvert accountability processes, provide opportunities for corruption. They allow ruling elites to govern for their personal and political benefit. And we can see a correlation between that and then support for Chinese interests in the region. Now, we, as you just said, I think we do have a kind of strategic interest in supporting democratization in our neighborhood. In the past, we could probably be quite passive about it. We could probably say, okay, we can be patient. Maybe in the next 20, 30 years, if we help other countries develop sustainably, then eventually we can hope that democratization is furthered. I think my major pitch would be now we have the added issue of China actually encouraging democratic backsliding in the region. So we can't afford to continue to be passive. And if we are passive, we don't counter those narratives that China promotes. So we haven't talked about that, but China actively promotes its own vision of international order that is a authoritarian capitalist kind of hybrid. They actively talk about why that model is better and more effective for economic development. And in a lot of parts of Southeast Asia, they look at democracy in a much more instrumental fashion. Normal people will look at democracy and say, well, what does it do for me? How does it deliver on economic development? And at the moment, we're leaving those kind of narratives uncounted. We don't talk about democracy. We don't talk about how democracy is entwined with economic development and better outcomes for people. And in terms of our strategic objectives, if we don't talk about democracy or support it, we're actually not countering elite capture. And elite capture is now effectively like a huge problem in Southeast Asia and the Pacific in terms of our own strategic influence.
Perfect. I hope at least Prime Minister Albanese is able to hear that stump speech from one of Australia's leading academics on this very topic. So with that, I want to get to the number and the fact or a number or a stat that you think is relevant to this issue. I know I might have blindsided you with this, but I think sometimes we're talking about sort of qualitative differences on democracy, but do you have any sort of quantitative figure that you think is relevant?
Can I give you two? I'll give you two. One, these are the stats from Freedom House that I've already mentioned, the 18th consecutive year of democratic decline in the world on political and civil rights. So I think we should have that in our minds, that we're not in that post-Cold War period where everyone was very much hopeful that democratization would continue unabated, and we can see that's actually not true anymore. I would say a distinction, maybe a statistic about the difference between Japan and Australia in terms of prioritization of how they utilize ODA would be that Australia supports governance with about 20 to 25% of its ODA program going towards the broad category of governance. But I would caveat that by saying that a lot of that ODA is actually about building capacities of governments to deliver services, not actually really primarily about democracy support and building cultures of democracy. And then I'll give you a statistic from Japan, was that in 2022, Japan only spent 0.46% of its ODA on democracy support and spent around 50% of its ODA on infrastructure, so to compete with the BRI directly. So that shows you the kind of priorities. Even though you might have rhetoric, then there's the actual priorities on the ground.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Lavina. That was a fantastic conversation, and I encourage everyone listening to please read her report on our website, ussc.edu.au. This is an excellent report on a topic that, as I said, is not discussed enough and is done by someone who has been following this topic for many years now. And I hope that we can have you back on again soon to talk about your next report on these issues.
Thank you so much, Jared, and to the US Study Center for supporting the report and the project in general. I really appreciate it.
As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Test Board podcast with Jude Blanchett, the Freeman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'd also recommend checking out our USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including the panel discussions from the inaugural Sydney International Strategy Forum. You can find these on our website, ussc.edu.au.